Vengeful Honour by Nick Kime. Orcs still rampaged over Armageddon Secundus, far off in the wastes or embedded deep in the bowels of the hive city they had taken. The guttural shouts and challenges of Thracker's hordes carried on a hot breeze. Reeking of ash and ripe with the stench of burning meat, the distant ruckus soon faded into obscurity, though, as ubiquitous as the wind, in the shadow of the Diablo Mountains and the Camp Fortis. Ballack knew a combat blade's monomolecular edge needed little sharpening, but considered it a ritual. A space marine seldom slept, ate, or drank. His every thought and deed bent towards being a better warrior, stronger, tougher, deadlier. Of late, Ballack had felt his transhuman prowess ebbing. A deep wound inflicted during an honourless duel had healed poorly. Perhaps it was karmic. His was the dirty blow, ending the duel but earning an injury in return. It had left his skin knotted and scarred. The flesh was tight and the muscles stiff. It had diminished him. His brothers knew it, and they would not tolerate his weakness. Not for long. Not in the Marines Malevolent, as part of the elite vilifiers. Ballack thought he heard Castor training nearby. He wondered if his captain had Narlek or Vathed in the ring with him. Or perhaps he had found a warrior from another chapter to hone his skills against. There were many Adeptus Astartes on this dirty world. Not all considered allies by the Malevolence. There was no sparring cage as such. Only billet tents remained. Basically all that was left of Armageddon in the region still held by Imperial forces. From Hades, more a burning crater than a hive city now, the vilifiers had moved on, seeking further battles. Orders to advance further east to secure the Amenities Bridge had stalled, while secondary and tertiary battle companies could be mustered. Castor reckoned on the Black Templars being a part of those forces.
That should be interesting.
Ballack had thought at the time. The Crusading Sons of Dawn were one of those chapters who might be considered antagonistic to the Malevolence. His ritual, not limited to his combat blade, Ballack had unsheathed and broken down a veritable arsenal. It sat on a rough blanket in front of him. A chain sword, several teeth detached from the belt, awaiting reintroduction. Bolt pistol, clip, and shells exposed. Firing mechanism pulled out and in need of oiling. Bolter, same as pistol. With the iron sights also removed, an underslung grenade launcher separated from the main body. Grenade belt and all frags looped from the bandolier. Cleaning, lapping, oiling, efficiency check, reassembly, and then recheck, followed by live fire with the exception of grenades. A warrior was only as effective as his weapon he wielded. For Ballack, he needed each and every one to be its optimum efficiency. His tools of war might be well worn, like the patchwork armour that was lying next to his weapons. Might, but they were always combat ready. The last blade was his by dint of theft, as was part of the war plate now repainted in the yellow and black livery of the Marines Malevolent. A huge double-handed sword with a concomitant power core that could energize the blade, set apart from the rest of its trappings. The hilt and quillions betrayed its provenance. Black Templars. Despite its obvious superiority to every other weapon Ballack possessed, it had remained in its sheath.
Are you ever going to draw that?
Ballack looked up from honing the combat blade.
I assumed it was you I heard sparring, brother captain.
Castor stepped into the half-shelled ruins that had recently been regaled with an imperial flag and Aquila standard. It had been municipal hall or a temple, or something that had ceased to have any meaning or usefulness since the war.
Vathed. Pity. I hoped he'd be up against your sword. Perhaps have a half length of it jutting from his abdomen.
Castor smiled coldly. He knew of the enmity between the Vilifire's rawest recruit and its oldest veteran.
What are you doing, Ballack? Trying to compensate for the fact you've lost your edge?
Ballack felt his jaw tense and had to fight to unclench his teeth and fists. He straightened up, despising himself for grimacing from the pain and the weakness it betrayed.
An old dog can still bite, even one without all its teeth.
Ballack realized he had his combat blade in his hand and made a conscious effort to lower it so he would look less confrontational.
I have teeth. And the sword, is that why it remains undrawn? Because you want to show your teeth?
I don't need a crutch, if that's what you're suggesting. I keep it sheathed because it's a trophy, and I have no need for a cutting sword almost as tall as I am. It doesn't suit me. Ballack was lean and wiry for a space marine. In the light of the buzzing sodium lamp he was working by, his face appeared gaunt and pale, unarmoured, exposing the neural ports in his mesh that sat beneath his battle plate. He was almost a head shorter than Castor. His grip tightened around the combat blade.
Have you come to thin the herd, Castor? Are you making way for my replacement?
Castor was about to leave, but shook his head before stepping back into the shadows.
Just seeing if you still had teeth, brother. The orcs beckon us again soon. I want to know all the Vilifiers can pull their weight. If you're not going to use the sword, though, get rid of it. We've had enough enemies here without further goading the Black Templars. The armor is one thing, that's just repurposing. But keeping trophies as if they're a foe we've vanquished, not wise.
Ballack watched him go and felt a few more grains trickle through the neck of his hourglass. 3 decades he had been a Vilifier, and a Malevolent longer than that. He supposed war ground everyone down eventually, even transhuman space marines. He wouldn't sleep. None of them would. Let the guards slumber. The mortals needed their rest. Ballack felt like doing anything but sleeping. He was restive, angry. After he finished stripping down and reassembling his weapons, he decided to walk to the edge of the camp. Despite what the flag and standard boasted, the ruins were not really Imperial territory. In war, ownership was ephemeral. It could shift as suddenly as a riptide and drown the complacent and ill-prepared in blood. Ballack wore his armour, even the dented shoulder guard where a greenskin had tried to take a bite out of it, the teeth marks extending as high as his gorget. Any harder or longer in the vice of the orc's jaw, and it would have been his neck. Too close. He'd left most of his weapons behind, taking the combat blade and pistol because they were light. They made room for the heavy Templar sword. Castor had been right. Parading trophies from supposed allies attracted undue attention. Such concerns had never been his to worry about. Perhaps his morbid thoughts about his own mortality had caused them to stir. A makeshift graveyard lay not far from the camp's border, too grim and demoralizing to be within sight of conscripts, and not so far the orcs could defile it without reprisal. It wasn't much, a scrap of earth decorated with broken swords, or the stock of a lasgun, rammed barrel first into the ground as a marker. Chains of ident tags wrapped around them. Ballack felt nothing as he walked amongst the memorials. Grief was for the weak. He would bury the sword amongst the anonymity of the graves, just another hollow monument. He had half unsheathed the blade, exposing some of the ornate filigree, when a grim voice called for his attention.
Malevolent!
Flat, declarative, but with a mote of arrogance they all carried. Ballack turned, one hand on the grip of his bolt pistol, but let go when he saw the two warriors had already drawn down on him. Inwardly, Ballack cursed. Black Templars. Even worse was that they knew him.
Vorda. Magellan.
He nodded cordially to the pair of sword brethren. The title was misleading. They didn't just use swords. Vorda had an axe, Magellan a mace. It was their old sergeant, Tiamat, who had carried the sword, the same one that Ballack had been out to ram into the ground and then forget. Vorda levelled his axe blade in challenge, so posturing and needlessly demonstrative. Ballack wondered if every verbal exchange between Templars was conducted in so formal a manner.
Do you remember what I said to you when we last met, Malevolent?
Vorda asked, snarling.
Your exact words? Vorda scowled.
Don't make me gut you where you stand, whore's son. I have a debt, a levy against my honour. The markings on Vorda's war plate suggested he had been promoted in Tiamat's stead. Ballack could not imagine how excruciating that must be for him. The guilt, allied to a deep sense of martial pride, so ambivalent. He would have laughed out loud had he not believed the two sword brethren would have cut him down for his impudence. Instead, he held up his hands. Will you beg for your life, dog? Snapped Magellan. It speaks, thought Ballack, but again chose wisely not to voice his inner monologues. You are the second person this night to compare me to a dog.
An apt description,
Magellan growled. Ballack addressed Vorda.
You said, when we meet again, and we will, there will be no duel, no quarter given. Does slaying a fellow warrior unarmed in cold blood satisfy that pledge, sword brethren?
Vorda smiled. Neither Templar wore his helm, presumably so Ballack could see the cold fury in their eyes, or the righteous indignation. A black crusader cross marked their noble faces, a demonstration of their ardent fealty.
I won't kill you here amongst the honoured dead.
He gestured to the blade.
Keep that. You might need it.
Ballack raised one eyebrow.
For what exactly? Our jewel, and Tiamat's sword, the prize. And if I refuse?
Magellan racked the side of his bolt pistol. Ballack nodded, approving of the strong-arm tactics.
I see.
Vorda's eyes narrowed. He can see I'm wounded, thought Ballack. He must have known Tiamat's blade cut deep.
And if I triumph?
Asked Ballack.
What is to stop you from sending another one of your vengeful brothers after me? You won't.
Ballack frowned.
You mean, we won't. Triumph,
declared Vorda with cold finality.
But should some miracle take place, you have our word that this will be the end of it.
Ballack jerked his head at Magellan.
That goes for him too, doesn't it?
Magellan took a step forward, but a glare from Vorda stopped him going any further.
You will be unarmoured when Vorda's blade strikes you dead.
He snarled, but then relented.
But I'll abide by my brother's word. See that rise?
Said Vorda, gesturing to a distant hill with his axe.
You have an hour. Come alone, or my brethren will erase you and your kind from existence. No seconds?
Ballack was looking at Magellan, who, despite what he had said, didn't seem wholly on board with the plan. Vorda was adamant, however.
Just you and I, to the death.
Ballack shrugged, trying to hide his annoyance.
To the death.
The Templars departed, the armour clanking loudly in their wake, and Ballack watched them go until they were lost to shadow. He turned to regard the site Vorda had chosen. The hill had been a landing pad. Some of the auger towers and comm stations were still intact around it, but it had been bombed to the eye and back.
dense crater field surrounded and invaded by ruins had no use as a landing zone anymore. It would be just as fine as an arena. Far enough away that no prying eyes would intrude, close enough that it wasn't in the heart of Orc territory. Ballack considered returning to the camp for reinforcements, but that would only further imperil his standing with the vilifiers. Take another Templar's head, and that might garner him some respect. But in truth, he went alone, because he had something to prove to himself, that he still had teeth. By the time Ballack had gone back for his chain blade and reached the ruin hillside, it was deep into night hours. Dawn was still far off, and the darkling silhouettes of distant Orc warbands plagued the horizon. Set against a hazy shroud of flickering umber, the greenskins were burning again. They liked fire, or rather what it did to wood, metal, and flesh. But Ballack soon found himself in a crater-strewn landing field. Any bodies had been since removed or eaten, but the wreckage lay dormant. Glyphs had been cut into a skirt of the rock, delineating the largest of the craters. Orcs had been there, but there was no further spore as far as Ballack could see. He began to pace the large crater, getting a feel for it, how to stand, the slight incline to the north, the density of the gravel underfoot. Ballack was about to look at his helm's internal chrono when Vorda's voice from the darkness answered his unspoken question.
I am surprised,
he said. Ballack noted the sword brethren's axe already in his gauntleted grip.
And alone also.
Vorda stepped forwards, in the meagre light of the halogen strip array that flickered intermittently but still had power.
You had me watched?
Asked Ballack.
Not very noble. Neither are you.
Ballack conceded to the point with a curt nod. Both warriors were under 50 paces apart, as they circled one another like stalking wolves. The distance shrank.
Is this about honor for you, or something else, Vorda?
Ballack asked, keenly appraising the Black Templars' movement, the way he held his blade, his stance as he shifted. Ballack went on, the circle ever tightened between them.
If you want revenge, you could have just shot me dead at the graveyard. I want you dead,
Vorda told him.
But I want to beat you first.
Said Ballack, understanding.
It's pride.
Tiamed had been an exceptional swordsman. Ballack was just some wretch who had cut him down ingloriously, through a twist of fate rather than skill. Vorda needed to prove the truth he felt in his heart, and not the lie he believed in his head, that Tiamed had been bested by a superior fighter. A snarl came from behind Vorda's faceplate before he spat a reply.
Draw my brother's sword, so I can wrest it from your dead grasp.
Ballack unsheathed the Templar blade, admiring the craft before jamming it into the earth.
I am a more brutal creature.
Vorda's sneer came through in his tone.
You are unworthy of it. I cannot deny that,
Ballack said, reaching over his shoulder to pull the chainsword from its maglock on his back.
Shall we begin?
Vorda nodded, lowering his axe blade so it jutted at the Malevolent like an accusation or a challenge. Thumbing the ignition stud, Ballack felt the satisfying churn of blades. About to engage him, he stopped at Vorda's upraised hand. Ballack frowned behind his blunt faceplate.
Is this supposed to be guile, Templar?
Vorda half turned towards something that he'd seen in the shadows. A shot rang out, dense, loud, and rippling the air. Vorda staggered, struck in the chest. He roared, but the answering gunfire eclipsed his fury. The muzzle flashes lit up the dark, kicking out solid slugs that took the Templar in the thigh, chest, and shoulder. He grunted.
Orcs!
And fell, wounded. Ballack was moving, forgetting Vorda, to engage the beast emerging from the gloom, hulking, tusked.
porcine brutes. Their leathered flesh was almost black, not green. Heavy shell fire detonated against Ballack's right knee, shattering armor plate and cracking bone. He sank down to one knee, just a few strides from where Vorda had collapsed. 3 more shots hit the Templar. The blood splatter reached Ballack's warplate and staining it. The axe hitting the ground rang out like a death knell. Ballack had only just struggled to his feet, spitting and cursing profusely as a second fat shell ripped through his shoulder guard and tore a piece of his breastplate. His stunned fingers released the chainsword, which chewed and growled in empathy with its former wielder as it lay prone in the crater's blood-flecked earth. His retinal feed told him he was wounded. Ballack's biosigns turned amber just before he got his helmet wrenched off. The orcs had done the same to Vorda too. Without the impediment of the helm, or perhaps because they were close enough for Ballack to smell their fetid breath, he realised their skin wasn't dark on its own. The orcs wore camouflage. He reached for his knife. A cold ring of metal pressed against his right temple stopped him.
No. Shadown. Move.
It spoke, halting, not in its own guttural dialect. It used Gothic. The greenskins could understand and converse in the Imperial tongue. It was an aberration that stoked the fires of Ballack's hatred, but since this war, little had surprised him about the orcs and what they were capable of. Up close, Ballack noticed they wore something approximating uniforms and had rank insignia. It had been planned. All of it.